Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? Managing the fiscal impacts of PPPs.
Hello, my name is Isabel Real. I'm a senior economist of the Expenditure Policy Division at the International Monetary Fund. Today, we are going to be talking about managing fiscal risk from PPPs. PPPs have been used by governments to deliver public infrastructure assets and services for centuries. Canals, rails, ferries, water systems, power networks, and roads were built privately in exchange of toll-raising capacity or direct government payments. More recently, PPPs are enjoying a global resurgence in popularity, given the perception of large infrastructure needs in most economies. This is the consequence of insufficient public investment, given tight fiscal conditions in most economies in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Despite their increasing popularity with governments, experience suggests that greater care is needed to safeguard public finance from potential fiscal costs and risks arising from PPPs. So why do governments do PPPs? PPPs can appeal to governments not only for efficiency reasons, but because they allow new investment to be undertaken without any immediate increase in reported government deficit or debt. However, this rests largely on an illusion, because in the absence of efficiency gains, PPPs and publicly procured projects have a similar long-run effect on public finances. In some countries, the government defers payments, but ultimately must still pay for the full cost of the project. In others, it concedes the right to collect user fees, and therefore it loses revenues that would have collected if the project had been procured traditionally. The private partner would never consciously pay or fund a PPP project. It will provide finance in the expectations that it will be repaid, including a rate of return commensurate with the risk it bears. This PPP illusion, or the misperception of what typically is known as infrastructure for free, encourage governments under pressure to reduce the deficit or debt in the short term to use PPPs, even if, in the long run, PPPs cost more than public procurement. They can be seen much more affordable, even if they are not, creating a bias in their favor. There are many factors underpinning this PPP bias. First, a weak monitoring capacity of PPPs across the public sector, and particularly at the level of Ministry of Finance or budgetary authorities. Second, a lack of integration of PPPs in budget process, medium-term fiscal frameworks, and debt sustainability analysis, meaning that PPPs are typically what we call off-budget operations. And third, there is a lack of transparency in fiscal reporting practices and quantification of fiscal risk. The PPP bias had led governments to assume financial commitments that later prove unaffordable. Therefore, we worry about PPPs because mistakes can be costly, and some countries had paid early for them. Governments like Australia, Canada, Chile, France, and UK, among others, have used PPPs extensively, and while problems have occurred, their overall experience with PPPs seems to be satisfactory. However, other governments have not been that successful, and PPPs have had a negative impact on public finance and overall macroeconomic stability. For example, Portugal made extensive use of PPPs in the early 2000s, mainly to develop its road network. The government committed to future periodic payments to the private partner, in addition to providing extensive revenue guarantees. Most of these transactions were off budget, therefore excluded from general government gross debt. This gave the government a false level of confidence in terms of fiscal sustainability, while the actual fiscal position have deteriorated significantly. The 2008 global financial crisis significantly reduced demand for PPP services, triggering the revenue guarantees and forcing the government to recognize a significant part of PPP commitments as general government debt, with significant macroeconomic implications. Therefore, PPPs can potentially obscure efforts towards fiscal discipline. They certainly reduce budget flexibility by committing public funds in long-term contracts and allow moving spending off budget, creating firm and contingent liabilities for the government. As shown in the Portugal example, if not properly managed, fiscal risk from PPPs can potentially have significant macroeconomic implications. So, how can governments benefit from PPPs without weakening public finance and jeopardizing macroeconomic stability? Governments can implement a four-pillar strategy for ensuring that potential benefits from PPPs are reaped. They could procure good projects, have good institutions in place, have good laws and regulations, and good fiscal accounting and reporting to properly monitoring PPPs. The first pillar for managing fiscal risk from PPPs then is pursuing good projects. That is to say, government should have sound project planning, evaluation and selection for all investment projects, including PPPs. There should be a clear investment strategy to select public investment projects on the basis of national priorities and cost-benefit analysis. Once a project is selected, the next step should be to determine whether procuring it as a PPP provides greater efficiency than public procurement. Spending decisions should be consistent with budgetary restrictions to ensure fiscal sustainability and take into account long-term fiscal implications of investment projects. The second pillar of this strategy refers to strong fiscal institutions for dealing with PPPs. It is essential that the Ministry of Finance manage a gateway process that gives it sufficient control at each stage of the PPP process. At any point of this process, the Ministry of Finance should have the ability to stop projects that are fiscally unaffordable. A dedicated PPP unit with specialized and capable staff can be helpful in managing this process. It can also be useful for ministries of finance to establish ceilings in both the stocks and flows of PPPs to help control for their fiscal risks. The third pillar refers to a sound legal framework. This should establish a clear, fair and predictable legal environment for the private sector to operate. The legal framework should also clarify the role and responsibilities of all relevant counterparts in a PPP transaction, both from the public and the private side. Last but not least, there is a need for good budgeting, fiscal accounting and reporting for PPP transactions. This should aim to achieve full and transparent disclosure of all future budgetary costs and fiscal risks arising from PPPs. The impact of PPPs of future government spending should be incorporated in that sustainability analysis and medium-term budgetary frameworks. The use of commitment appropriations in the budgetary process, which authorize governments to commit public resources for future years, can also be helpful in drawing attention to the future costs of PPPs, practices that are common in countries like in Germany and to a lesser extent in Colombia. Therefore, we can conclude that under certain conditions, PPPs can be effective in delivering public infrastructure assets and services, but they also entail fiscal risks. These risks are not theoretical, and some countries have paid dearly for them. Yet, governments can take actions to manage fiscal risks from PPPs to promote successful outcomes. They can pursue good projects and do PPPs only if they are efficient. They can strengthen their legal and institutional environment and implement transparent fiscal accounting and reporting procedures to adequately monitor them. Finally, reputational risks are important. Governments embarking in PPPs should be prepared to manage and monitor them in the long run. Start small, develop expertise, and build reputation where learning from past mistakes are key elements of a successful experience.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.